So I'll do kind of a soft start here, but hello everyone, I'm Day Cooper Hagel and I'm the Director of Mental Health Wilderness First Aid, and I'll pass it over to Jeremy Addleman to introduce himself afterwards, but I'll do a little bit of an introduction for you, Jeremy. So Jeremy and I did our master's degree together at the University of Victoria in counseling and psychology several years back. And so we've kind of gone separate ways, but reconvened at times to talk about different issues and consult and that sort of thing. So it's been great to have Jeremy kind of come on as one of our guest speakers here. We also have Rachel, who is doing our admin and background and kind of tech supporty side of things while all of these events are going on. And we have all of you. So very happy to see some folks here. So Jeremy's a clinical counselor in private practice. He specializes in somatic psychotherapy and trauma counseling in Victoria, BC in Canada. And he has a master's in counseling psychology, like I said, like myself, from the University of Victoria, and is a Canadian certified counselor with the Canadian Counseling and Psychotherapy Association, again, like myself. Let's see, what did I write here about Jeremy? Jeremy's background as a clinical counselor includes supporting adults with anxiety, depression, trauma, PTSD, stress, grief and loss, personal growth, relationships, life transitions, anger management, and addiction. He worked for years as a clinical counselor at the Men's Trauma Center in Victoria, and one of his special projects there was to develop and run a crime prevention program, bringing young offenders into the Men's Trauma Center with the objective of reducing recidivism and increasing the accessibility of trauma counseling for young men who are involved in the legal system. Jeremy is also an avid outdoorsman with a significant appreciation for the power of natural spaces to aid in facilitating healing for oneself and others. You can find him out hiking in the hills around Victoria nearly every day with his dog, Callie, and that's definitely something that I remember about Jeremy's. Every day after class or after clinic or whatever it is that we'd be doing, be like, Jeremy's like, okay, I'm off to the hills. Yeah, it's really good to have you here, Jeremy.
Thanks, Day. Yeah, today is one of the days I won't be going to the hills. But I made sure I went every day before this week so that the dog is not too antsy.
On the walls, yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's great to meet everybody. Thanks for those introductions. I hope I can provide something of interest today. My talk is going to be maybe a little different in terms of some of the stuff Dave's done. It's going to be a little bit about what you can do based on a somatic psychotherapy perspective to just generally increase your mental health ability, especially around resilience against traumatization, with a brief bit also about how to respond to traumatization in the field or outdoors. Also, just in general, it's sort of a general idea, but I'll talk specifically about being outdoors, but it's transferable. Yeah, so hopefully this provides some information, a little bit about where I'm coming from. So I've been training for about 3 years in a trauma modality called somatic experiencing. That's where a lot of this information comes from. It comes from also other forms of trauma theory, but it's quite informed by that. And it's a form of therapy and a theory of trauma that has its focus on the nervous system, and that traumatization is a condition in which the nervous system has become overtaxed and stuck. And so it's not so much a sad and scary memory issue from our perspective. It's a biological or neurological sort of condition. So I'll just explain a little bit. I'll start by explaining a little bit about the nervous system. Please forgive me if this is all repetitive for people. So the nervous system is part of our body. We have peripheral and a central nervous system. The central nervous system is our brain and our spinal cord. These are just really big bundles of nerves. And from the bundle of nerve in our spine or spinal cord, we get nerves that come out the rest of our body into our organs. And that's the peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system has one part to it, and it is called, or one part that we're going to focus on today, and it's called the autonomic nervous system. So this is a part of the nervous system that it kind of has the secret in the name. It's auto, so it's sort of an autopilot, automatic system. And this is a part of our body we don't have control over. It sort of acts for us, and it is responsible for both activating our bodies for action, so for mobilization. This could be normal behavior, and thanks, Day. And it could also be for extreme action, but it doesn't have to be. So it's any sort of mobilization. This is standing up, eating, talking, breathing, anything that is like an action is our autonomic nervous system using one side of it called the sympathetic nervous system, the sympathetic side. And then there's a counter side to the autonomic nervous system called the parasympathetic nervous system. And this is responsible for bringing us back down to rest. So when we get activated for action, we need a deactivation. We don't just only have activation and it disappears. We actually have a corresponding deactivation. And so there's this push and pull that's always happening between within our autonomic nervous system. And that is the part of our body that can get traumatized. And so when we talk about PTSD, psychological trauma, these kind of things, that's the spot, that's the area where the wound can occur from our perspective in somatic experiencing and somatic psychotherapy. So the thing about this system is that like I said before, we can't actually control it. It's very much like our circulatory system. So we have blood and our heart, and that just sort of is what it is. We can't tell our heart when to beat. We can't tell it when to beat faster. But what we can do is we can train our heart and our blood vessels to respond well to variability. So we can train to handle the spike to have a fast heart rate and then come back down to a low heart rate. And that's sort of all we can do with our autonomic nervous system as well, is we can train it to handle high activation and coming back down to rest in a very fluid and congruent and coherent way. So that's sort of what I'm going to be focusing on when I talk about resilience, when I talk about traumatization. It's all about this system that needs to be able to go up and down. So that's just a little bit of a backgrounder on what I'm going to be talking about. And then I kind of want to specify a little bit about what I mean when I say trauma as well, before I get into this. So I'll start with what trauma isn't. Trauma isn't a type of situation. So trauma is not a car crash. Trauma is not war, or trauma is not capsizing a boat in like bad conditions. It's not a cougar attack. It could be all of those, but it isn't those things. Someone in those situations could be traumatized by those events, and at the same time, someone in those situations may not be traumatized by those events. So that brings us to what trauma is, and the way I would define it, and keep in mind, these are sort of my understandings based on my training and my clinical work. So trauma, from my perspective, is an experience where a person is confronted with something they are incapable of tolerating. And it pushes us beyond what we call our window of tolerance. So we all have this window of sympathetic nervous system activation that we are willing or able, sorry, to tolerate. And I'm just gonna share my screen for a second here, because I have a really terrible drawing. So give me one sec. Okay, so this is, I'm not an artist, so forgive me. This is a sort of an example of what I mean by the window of tolerance. We all have a baseline, which is labeled here as rest, and that's what we're feeling. That's the state we're in. Not when we're doing a Zoom presentation, when we're when we're watching TV or just sleeping, basically. And this area here of activation, the green area, that is everything we do. So if you guys can see my cursor, right? Okay, so if you're around here in this, like this, so this curve here is like someone being activated, someone's nervous system being activated. This is sympathetic. So my sympathetic nervous system might turn on about like this much if I'm just going on like a gentle stroll on like a pretty easy hike, maybe something I've done before. It's like a nice time, right? But it's still activation. You know, this is something a little more, maybe up here, this is more in the fight or flight zone. This is, maybe I'm a little scared. Maybe my heart rate is increasing. I maybe have to use more physical effort. And so what happens in this zone is my muscles get tense, blood pools in or gets sent to big muscle groups away from organs, things like this, to prepare me to fight or flee. But that doesn't have to be danger. It could just be really exciting or really demanding, like a race or something like that.
Sometimes we call that type 2 fun, Jeremy.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, this is right here is on the edge of a really hard rock wall that you're trying to, climb for the last 2 months. So if you're having that activation and it's within your window of tolerance, so like I said, this is a experience that you have the capacity to tolerate, then you'll use that energy. So that sympathetic activation happens, you use the energy, and you kind of reach your peak. And you usually kind of either purge all the energy you can, and you're still generally safe, everything's okay, or you just kind of don't need any more because you've accomplished what you need to accomplish. And your parasympathetic nervous system will activate at that point, and it'll start to bring you down. It'll deactivate your sympathetic system, bring you back down to rest. So that's what happens when we are activated for and pushed to be prepared to handle something of potential extremeness, but within our window of tolerance. So this is a lot of what like we experience when we're out in the field, or if you're boating, like you're gonna have this. This is a good thing. So the problem is this other terrible drawing. When the event you're exposed to in that situation actually demands your sympathetic system, so your activation, to go higher than what you're actually willing or able to tolerate. So your body's not prepared for it. The situation unfolds in a way that you just actually are overwhelmed by it, literally. And so what happens is if you go past your upper level, this threshold, we go into this red zone, this freeze and dissociation mode. And so the reason this happens is based on evolution. We have this ingrained system within us. It's not a bad thing that it exists, but it can cause a bad thing, which I'll explain later. So the reason it exists is because basically freezing, like a deer in headlights kind of thing, or even fainting, can be a really adaptive thing when you're experiencing immense pain, immense fear, or in the past, like this is very evolutionary and very old, ancient. So it's a bit about predator prey. If a predator is going after us and we faint, they may not have to kill us, right? So it's a survival mechanism under extreme duress. And so it's unfortunate to have to go there, but it is a healthy thing to freeze when you do go there. So that's not a pathology, but it could cause one if we don't handle it properly. So this is a zone we might have all experienced. We might know people who experience, and I'll talk a lot more about that as we continue. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can look at my notes. Yeah, so the thing is, the reason we may be over our window of tolerance doesn't actually have to do with our skill set. So I want to get away from this idea that if you learn to paddle better, or you get more stronger thighs, you'll be better at hiking, these kind of things, you won't actually necessarily affect your window of tolerance. Like, this isn't a skill issue. It's a neurophysical capability in that very moment issue. So I'm going to start using the word neurological load, or the words neurological load, because that's what this is about. So let's say, so you could have an immense skill at, let's say, boating, but if you have a heavy neurological load that day and something goes wrong, you may be at a higher risk of traumatization from a serious event, capsizing, something like that, than you will a different day when you have less of a neurological load. And so what I mean by a neurological load specifically, this can be psychological stuff like relationship stress, prior anxiety from whatever's happening, poor sleep, illness, a previous traumatization that's put you into that freeze zone like recently. These are all things that I would call neurological load. And so if you're coming into an event with a high neurological load or heavy neurological load, that puts you more at risk of traumatization than even having low skills at the thing you're doing. So we want to think of this as not something you can master life away from. Like, you can't just like become a very skilled person. And we want to not stigmatize trauma as like being unprepared. We want to become much stronger at being in relationship with our nervous system, because that's going to be the thing that really makes the difference. So someone could be incredibly well prepared for the outdoors, but if they've experienced recent traumatization, they've recently been ill, relationship stress, they might have a weird day where they get lost in the woods. And normally they can orient their way back, no problem. And that causes a traumatization and could lead to like post-traumatic stress issues. And so this could happen to anyone. And it's not skill-based. So is that all making sense? No, yeah, okay.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah, please.
Do you connect the idea of window of tolerance to resilience? Like, is your idea of resilience kind of expanding the window of tolerance?
Yeah, exactly.
Or are you going to, I don't want to interrupt you.
No, it's a great primer. That is exactly what I will talk about. And so, yeah, so So the idea here is that that window of tolerance grows and shrinks. And I'll talk a lot more about that, but basically resilience increases the window and traumatization decreases the window. And it's a fluid thing. It can change throughout life. And that's the space of variability. It's like how, like if we're thinking about the heart rate as a metaphor, how high of a heart rate can you get? And how quickly does it go back up and down? That's sort of like what we're talking about. So how high can you get in terms of like your stress level, basically? And how quickly does it come back down when it needs to? That's going to be like a really resilient place to be. So we'll talk a bit more about what that means in terms of how you can do that. Yeah. So from a somatic perspective, there's another idea about trauma. So trauma is not only just the overwhelming experience past your window, but it's also what happens because you go into that free state. So when we go into that free state, we actually don't get to use the energy that we've built up. Excuse me. So for example, if I'm preparing to, you know, fight off a cougar, or you know, if I'm even if I'm just like lost, but the fear has been, you know, extreme that day for some reason, that fear is going to basically pump up my body to fight or run. And if I don't do anything with that because I'm now frozen, then I'm locked in with all that energy. And so from a somatic perspective, that is kind of what they would mean by traumatization. And it's why we have things, I see your hand, and I'll get to you in 1 second. It's why we have things like people who are really triggered by things like car horns and or just randomly being like anxious about stuff they might not be anxious with when they're home and living their lives. It's because they're kind of prepared to fight, but there's nothing to fight. So it just they keep getting like these like little instances of something that might be threatening, and they're already at like a 10 out of 10 on the prepared to do something level. So this is the idea of the sympathetic activation getting locked up. Yeah, Anna, go ahead.
Okay, so this is all so interesting. Thank you so much for sharing it with us.
Yeah, no worries.
I apologize if my question, maybe you touched on it in the couple of minutes before I was able to join on, but in my like college background in psychology, I was always kind of taught fight, flight, freeze as like options that people are predisposed to reacting one of those three ways. And this is the way that you're describing it makes it seem like activation is we're kind of always, everybody is predisposed to step into a fight or flight mode until we kind of break that through that threshold. Can you touch on that a little bit and just clarify my rudimentary college education on psychology?
Yeah.
Thanks.
No, exactly. And I think that you know, some of these neuropsychiatric and neuropsychological theories are fairly new, so they haven't necessarily like blended their way into traditional cognitive and behavioral psychology fully yet. But I think so. I heard those things too. So it was, you can't choose, right? You can't choose what you do. You either fight, flee, or freeze. And I would say that, you know, we all have a maybe a tendency to either fight or flee. So I think they're pretty accurate. They're pretty right there. That, you know, if let's use a cougar as an example. I'm going to use that a lot for some reason. But like, let's say you confront a cougar in the bush, and like there's going to be a selection of people that may instinctively, when activated by that threat, will maybe more likely fight the cougar, and there's going to be a selection of people that may more likely run from the cougar. There it is. Day had a toy cougar, if no one saw that and just saw me scream for no reason. So the interesting thing is you could be like a trained fighter, and in those actual threatening in situations, maybe you're a fleer. So it's kind of interesting what happens in those situations. But we in the somatic community and the somatic trauma community have really separated freeze from that. So it's fight, flight, or fight or flight, sometimes fight, sometimes flight. And I don't think there's a human out there that only does one. Maybe there's tendencies. And then there's freeze. So freeze is the response to overstimulation. And I think where people had it wrong, and I'm just a person, so I could be wrong, but where people, in my opinion, had this wrong in the past was that we had a very poor understanding of PTSD and post-traumatic stress, trauma in general. Like, trauma has been a very misunderstood condition. And so I think what has happened is that we so normalized trauma as a, or the trauma symptoms as just a way of being, that we have missed the fact that maybe a third of people on Earth are deeply traumatized. So we've just categorized frozen people as either as one of the three, the fight, flight, or freeze. But as I said earlier, with the question Day had, with the window of tolerance shrinking and growing, so resilience builds your window of tolerance and trauma shrinks your window of tolerance. So if someone has experienced an immense amount of trauma in their life, their window of tolerance will be very small. So now that person, under very low levels of activation, are gonna hit the freeze very fast. The same speed as someone who hasn't had trauma would still be in fight or flight. So that's what we might see as, oh, there's three options, and some people automatically freeze, some people automatically fight, and some people automatically flee. But I really think that there's just, those are two different things, and we just have normalized people being in freeze and not properly educated people and had environments for people to process that and move back into a healthy activation of fight or flight, if that makes sense.
That was Anna's question, so I don't want to interrupt, but I have a question if
Sure.
Anna doesn't have any follow-up.
No, go for it. That was awesome. Thanks.
I'm just curious if I'm correct in understanding that according to the somatic psychotherapy model, you kind of categorize a fight or flight response as a response that was within the window of tolerance and is maybe symptomatic of, I don't want to misspeak, but something like a healthier nervous system response than a freeze response. Is that correct?
No. So a freeze response is still a healthy response, but we want the freeze response to happen in a situation that is actually life-threatening. And so if we've taught our nervous system to think everything is life-threatening, that is an incongruence between our healthily working nervous system and its interpretation of the world. So it's still working. It's actually working extraordinarily well. It's learning very fast and very strongly. It's gotten information and it won't let it go. So we have to look at it as very healthy, and we just have to teach it what the world around it is actually like now. Because maybe at one point in time it was that threatening, right? Like when there was a cougar, the brain wanted to learn that there could be another cougar. And so the fact that now you have that response that you do to a cougar very fast, it's like your brain is like really smart, but it's just not properly connected to the fact that you're just like on the Baden Powell in Vancouver, and it's like there's cars parked just right there, right? So I think it's more about not having the right re-coaching of the nervous system, but it's still working very well. It's not a pathology. Yeah. Should I just go on?
Yeah, cool. Thanks.
Okay.
It's all making me think. I love it.
Yeah. Okay. So.
Oh, sorry. Kathleen did have a question in the
Sure.
chat. Kathleen said, would that be like oversensitized?
Exactly. Yes. So we can substitute resilience and trauma with the words desensitization and sensitization. They kind of fit. So desensitization, you're becoming more resilient. Sensitization is sort of more traumatized. But it's they're similar categories. So I think you're right. Yeah. So again, the idea of building resilience comes from being able to tolerate and stay mindful of sympathetic activation. So this idea of like resilience doesn't mean you're not going to feel fear or not feel excitement or activation, but it's that you're able to really be present with it. You're able to be like, wow, I'm very activated. I'm very scared. I'm in crazy waters on the West Coast, and it's like, I'm like, might fall off this boat, but that's okay, right? Like, I'm okay. Like, I'm here. It's scary, but I'm here and I'm present, and we're working through this. It's that place of like, I'm so afraid now that I've just shut down. That's the trauma zone. And what happens in that is that we stop actually feeling the fear. We stop feeling what our body is feeling like when we're under fear. So fear also includes muscle tension and sweating and stuff like that. So those are important things to actually be able to feel. We want to be able to feel that your neck is like tense, your shoulders are in your ears, that your thighs are now like pumped and ready to run, and you want to be sweaty. You want to know that. As soon as we actually are not being able to witness what our body is doing, that's when we're actually at risk of being in that trauma zone. It's not that we don't want the fear, we just want to be able to feel it. So when we have trauma, healing actually comes from building back this ability to tolerate and be with fear, be with tension and stuff like that. So basically, as a result, like part of the healing of trauma will be actually frightening yourself a little bit and being in your body a little bit, but just a little bit, just working within that window of tolerance. So let's say somehow we've been traumatized by a cougar event, and now our window of tolerance is very small. Maybe the fear of being back on a trail, even if it's an easy trail, there's no cougar sightings, there's nothing. The anxiety of doing that might be good, as long as you can stay present with that experience or present with other experiences while you're doing it. It doesn't have to be necessarily fear that you're present with, but present with activation. So it could be excitement, it could be happiness, doesn't matter. So I'm going to talk a bit about what you can do to stave that off a little bit. So I'll talk a little more after about that healing process that I just mentioned, but before we're ever traumatized, we can still work on growing that window of tolerance. And one of the things that I really like about nature is that it's a great place to practice building that resilience. So I'm just looking at my notes for a second, forgive me. Okay, Kathleen has a question here.
Sorry, that's me again, just writing.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah.
And maybe just read the question out loud, just because we're recording the audio and stuff, but not
Sure.
the questions.
Okay. I was thinking more of a paddling scenario, but since we were talking about people and cougars in the bush, if you had a really bad scare, say with a cougar in the bush, and then you find that every time you go out on the bush, you hear a little rustle, your heart rate just goes like way up. Is that correct to say that you're having like a panic attack, or is it anxiety, or I don't know if you can interchange those terms with this somatic experiencing?
Yeah, you definitely can. You can definitely intersperse those words. I wouldn't say that would be a panic attack. A panic attack is a very clinical term that describes like a presentation where you're really going into a space of extreme fear. Your heart rate's going up, sweating, like it becomes a feeling like you're going to die. It's quite extreme. But what you would have described there would be pretty intense fear or anxiety. So anxiety is a really good word there, or panic, but maybe not a panic attack. A panic attack would be a very specific thing. And that would be a result of being sensitized to that event, right? Your window tolerance is just slightly down because in the past, before that event, you might not actually have reacted that way to the snap of the twig, right? And so where we can come in here is we can actually push that back. So we don't have to now say, I'm forever afraid of a snap of a twig because of that event. We can be influenced by it and be like, oh, maybe I should be concerned. That's a good thing. But to like push back, and get rid of that reaction can be a very valuable thing. So yeah, so one of the ways that we can build resilience for this and for trauma and also for pushing back on some of these things is by being with our bodies and practicing being with our bodies in non-traumatizing situations. So we talk so much about like the fear and the anxiety and the scary stuff about being outdoors, but really one of the things about the outdoors that's amazing is that it's beautiful and it smells good and there's amazing sights to see, amazing sound. And those experiences also create activation, right? So we can build resilience by practicing being present with our bodies while activated from positive influences. So for example, and I would actually very much encourage people to do so. And so when we're like in the city or back home, you might be just living your lives. You might just be kind of going to work, eating dinner, whatever, changing the kids. And we've all heard of like mindfulness, I'm sure, and these recommendations to eat your meals more mindfully and brush your teeth more mindfully. And I think those are really good suggestions. And from my perspective, they do give us more resilience because they get us trained to be with our bodies when we're doing stuff. We get so practiced at escaping being present with our bodies while we're doing stuff. But I think life is already annoying and hard enough. Like I don't want to ask people to now like have their meal be like a job and like brush your teeth. Like you kind of want to space out. You kind of want to watch TV when you're eating. Like it's fine. So I think we should take advantage of being outdoors to do this. So because it's there, right? We have this, we're there to pay attention. So all I'm asking is that this is a great opportunity for people to take one more step at paying more attention, to pay attention to their bodies while doing this. And so trauma teaches us that our bodies are not safe and to freeze and to dissociate. So we need to practice the opposite of that. So I kind of want to just give everyone a little bit of like a brief exercise, if that works. I'm gonna feel free to not do it, but it's just going to be a little bit of a rundown of how you might want to like structure something like this, so it's not just purely theoretical. It's not going to be anything scary. It'll just be the positive stuff. So forgive me, but I'm just gonna jump right in, unless anyone has any questions before I start. Okay, so I'm going to invite everyone to, if you have a window, to look out the window. And if you don't have a window, just scan your space and allow your vision to land on something that is beautiful or inspiring or captivates you in any way, like something that you're just like, yeah, I like the way that looks. And if it's in nature, that's great. If it's just in your space, that's fine as well. And just stay with it. So try and just stay looking at it and look at everything about it. So if it's the tree, for example, trace the contours of the leaves and the wood and anything that's on it. Like really get to know what you're looking at, the colors. Dive right into that. Just take like 20 seconds. And while you're doing this, take that same attention that you were putting onto the tree or whatever you were looking at and bring it inwards, and the same attention, the same detail. Think about how your body is feeling as you did that and as you're doing it. Just notice what it's like to be with that experience. And then if possible, before just coming back, try going back to focusing on the thing, connecting with it, and then coming back to the space. So I'm curious if anyone wants to talk at all about what that might have been like. It's not supposed to be like profound or anything, but I'm just curious if that was like an extremely novel experience or if it did anything at all, if anyone wants to talk about it.
I really liked the way that it kind of, I think some people can get a little bit nervous when they are encouraged to like examine themselves or really be present with themselves. And I really liked the way that not like tricked you into doing it, but like you started off like being able to appreciate something outside of your body. So it made that bridge to appreciating or recognizing what's going on within your body a little bit easier. And then even like the simple thing of reconnecting with the item, whatever it was, before coming back to the group. I liked that for me, as somebody that is really into gardening and connecting with the natural world in that way. I felt like I'm looking at a plant right now in my room. I felt like I was able to form some sort of appreciation for both what was going on in my own body that I was recognizing and what I was recognizing in this beautiful ivy that I have in my room.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, and I think that's sort of what we like to do. We sort of talk about it as like a sandwich, and we talk about it as orienting to something outside that's positive before orienting inward, because it primes that attention to just say, okay, notice what it's like to be you. It's like, like that's like, I don't want to do that at all. So you're right. It really, it tricks you into that transition, but it also allows you to have the experience of when you do tap in to your own body, it to have been influenced also by that thing. So, because it's much easier to feel my own body after looking at my dog than it is to feel my own body after, seeing a car accident. Like those are like dramatically different inputs, and we don't realize it a lot of the time. We kind of walk around a little bit disconnected from the impact of things. And so by doing these practices all the time, and over and over again, every time you're gardening, every time you're out on a hike or anything, they're just such good opportunities to not only practice that sort of interoception, that being with the inner experience, but also the choosing what to be influenced by as well. And so having that more positive influence, even if it's an activation, a good activation, you're building resilience through positive means, you're practicing being with your body after positive influences. So it's a really functional way of building that relationship with yourself and building resilience. Okay, so a very similar practice is going to be helpful once trauma sets in. And so I would be very careful though with what I'm about to say. I don't advise anyone taking this information and helping someone else heal from traumatization. I'm going to talk more about what to do if something happens and you're with them in that moment, but take what I'm about to say here as like examples for ways you can help yourself if you feel comfortable to do this. So in the same vein of that practice we just had there, you can use your time outdoors to increase your window of tolerance after having been traumatized and having your window of tolerance decreased. So I'm going to touch into actually Kathleen's example. It was a really great example to use here. So, pardon me. So we'll use that idea of a cougar or something came by. So now you're afraid of the snapping of a twig. So this doesn't have to be extreme traumatization. It could just be sensitization and fear that has developed. What we can do is we can go back into these spaces, right? And we can do two things. We can do exactly what we just did. So building that routine of being with your body, of being present with activation that's positive, focusing on really inspiring visuals as the primer for that. But we can take it a step further if we're also healing and do the same sort of focusing and attention on the negative activation. So for example, you're out there and the twig does snap and you get that little bit of panic, that little bit of sensitized fear that Kathleen mentioned. That would be a very important moment to say, okay, I've noticed that sound, right? That sparked something for me. Let's bring that attention inward again. And what does that feel like? What do I notice, right? And when I ask myself that question, the things I'm going to be looking for are my heart rate, my temperature, muscle tone, you know, where on the scale of ears to chest are my shoulders, like, you know, like these like markers of tension, of stress. And so we want to be very non-judgmental about this activity. We want to say, oh, I am tense after hearing that twig, or I am tense, I'm feeling lost in a trail I know. I probably shouldn't, but I do. That's okay. Good. You feel it. You're building back this comfort zone. So it's not going to do any favors to ignore that. It will build your resilience back up. It will help heal your traumatization if you bring attention to it. If you convince your body, because again, this isn't a sick nervous system, it's a trained nervous system. So we're training the nervous system to listen to you and say, look, we don't actually have to fear this. I'm okay. I'm present with this, right? Yes, we had a crazy swell and the boat capsized, but this is just a gentle wave. And even if I fall, it's okay. I am scared, but we're safe. And that fear makes me feel tense. And I'm with that fear. That's okay. And eventually your nervous system, which thinks it needs to do things automatically for you, goes, oh, you know, Kathleen's got it. she'll keep us safe. Like she knows what she's doing. She doesn't seem to be dissociating, right? You know, our nervous system starts to trust us again, because when something's that threatening, it can't. It takes over for us. So we need to convince it we're here, and it's okay. We can handle this, even though it's scary. I'm feeling it. I'm active with it, but I'm here. And the more we do that, the more we push that window of tolerance back up if we've already had it drop. Does that make sense? Okay.
I know you said you don't recommend, folks going out and using this right now to help people. I'm just wondering, if you were to do something like that for yourself, would you recommend, like you mentioned, going back to the place, or back to a similar place, or back to wherever it is that you're experiencing this kind of maybe increased sensitization?
Yeah.
Would you say it would be most helpful to kind of start with a place that's the least activating but still a bit activating, and then kind of work on your window of tolerance from there? Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. Because the idea here is that we have to be present with the activation, or else it's going to decrease the window of tolerance even more, right? So this is why traditional forms of trauma therapy have been unhelpful. So we've talked about in the past, most trauma therapists would do things like just pure exposure therapy. So let's say, you got, like, you were scared about, rock climbing wall, or you fell off a wall, and so traditionally a therapist would be like, all right, well, we're going to do that climb every session for the next 10 weeks, and it had like a 30% success rate or something like that, which is terrible. And it just, because some people might somehow get desensitized to that, but most people would be put back into the full fear. And so it would just be reinforced over and over and over again. But what we would say is, like, go up to the wall, like sit there and like explore what it feels like to be in front of that wall, right? Pick up your paddle. If that is activating, then that's all we want to do. We want to be present and feel the activation from the most minuscule attempt at approaching the thing that created traumatization. And this is smooth. And smooth can work really fast. You'd be very surprised, right? One day of doing that means maybe tomorrow I can sit in the kayak on the beach. And when it kind of rocks over, that's like, right? But I feel that, it gets that pit in my stomach, my shoulders go up. Let's be with that. Good, right? And do that step by step by step. And you'd be shocked. Yeah, like it could be 3 times. And your window of tolerance starts bumping back up. The nervous system learns so fast, so well. That's why it drops so fast. And so this is kind of like, this is the angle we should sort of take if we're looking at responding to previous fear, previous traumatization, or any sort of thing that like creates a reaction, because we might not know it as trauma. We might know it as, I just don't really want to do that anymore. I don't want to go there. I feel uncomfortable. And so don't just go back and push yourself through it and dissociate. Go to the earliest point you can feel activation and be very present with it in the same way we practice kind of looking at the tree. So you are the tree, or you, whatever. I was looking at a tree. You weren't looking. Yeah.
I imagine for some folks, it might even just be like recalling the memory can be activating. Yeah. So just sitting with the memory.
Yeah.
And exploring the body. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. When I do trauma work with people, a lot of the time it's not about like accidents out in the bush or anything like that, but sometimes it is. But either way, whatever it is, I often will start by just saying, like, bringing up the idea of doing it, doing like trauma processing and touching into those memories and the thing, maybe explore some of the activities related to it. And they don't know it, but I'm doing trauma therapy by doing that, because they're activated by the suggestion of approaching the things that make them afraid. And so that is an opportunity to touch in at the earliest part. And that's all we want to do. It's not a bad thing, it's a really good thing. That's how smart the nervous system is. It's like, I don't trust this person. They're gonna go into a dangerous place and not be prepared. And so we gotta convince it. We gotta go, look, I'll show you. I can handle it at every step along the way. So yeah, and so traumatization, it basically it interrupts that ability to be with our body. And so we have to do everything we can to make it okay to be in our body. And like I said, that's both angles. That's being with the positive influence. So sitting at the beach and feeling the sand and exploring what it's like for your body to be in your body. That is a part of trauma healing, as is approaching the edge of the fear as well. So the last part here is about what happens with traumatization in the field. So if you're out there and it's happening, is there anything you can do? Do we just have to assume if something's overwhelming and we've hit that fear or that freeze, sorry, that we now have PTSD and we kind of have to go through this slow process of building back resilience? That's not true. We actually can do stuff. And so we can actually prevent the onset of post-traumatic stress by doing the right stuff. So yeah, so with we have to realize that we can also be a little bit ahead of the curve and get to know what our neurological load coming into events is. And so if I've had a great deal of stress that day or leading up, bad sleep, I should know that maybe things that scare me might scare me more that day. And not on a psychological level, right? On a neurological level, right? Spiders don't scare me, but maybe if I'm really stressed out, a spider on me would surprise me more than it might if I didn't come in with that stress. And that might pump me into that zone. So that's one way we can kind of like just be a little ahead of the curve. But another way of being ahead of the curve is checking in as much as possible when you're out. So the same way we did that activity, do that like as often as you can, because you might then know, you might get a sense of where your neurological load is. You might be like, oh crap, I'm very hungry and very tired, and I didn't really know, I wasn't paying attention. Maybe I need to take a break, have a snack. It's these simple things that like sound ridiculous, but if you ignore that, you've done two things. You've increased your load of stress, and you've been practicing dissociation or disconnection from your body. Two things that will predispose you to having a more likely traumatization. However, let's say something does happen to you. What's going to occur is, probably like a buildup of stress, a buildup of fear, and then kind of a numbing feeling. You feel a little different than you would. Maybe you feel too relaxed or too just kind of out of it. Maybe not relaxed is the word, but like exhausted, even though you're really activated. We may all have experienced this, right? You just kind of freeze, and in a place you may not have frozen before, in a situation you may not have frozen. So if that does happen, what we really want to do is acknowledge that the body does absolutely have a ton of energy in it. So even though you might feel frozen, you might feel tired, you also might be holding something back. So a lot of the time what we see is shaking. So I don't know if anyone here has experienced this or seen someone who experienced this, but someone coming back from a really stressful event may be holding back, but you might see it that there's like some micro shaking going on and like almost like shivering. So this is something you really want to encourage in yourself. So I would very much recommend, if you are shaking, Day, did you just hold something up?
I don't want to interrupt you, but I held up the book Why
No.
Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, because we talk about
Right.
that book in class.
Exactly. So that's the thing, is we all will be shaking, crying, laughing, even if it's like a terrifying situation, a sad situation, we might laugh, but it's just because it's our nervous system evacuating all this energy. And we feel shame about these things because we're stupid humans, right? Who have language and culture that for some reason shames normal things. And so we often hold back. We're like, no, I'm fine. I'm like, it's okay. And we just tense up, right? So what you want to do in this kind of a situation, if you're out there, something happens, shake, cry, laugh, anything your body's trying to do, let it happen. And if possible, and there's someone else around, if you feel comfortable with it, have them lay a hand somewhere that feels safe. So if it doesn't feel comfortable for you, that is absolutely important to acknowledge. So don't do it if it doesn't feel comfortable for you. But if it does feel comfortable for you, it can be a very grounding thing to have someone else touch a part of your body that brings you back into contact with your own body. So you'll then be shaking and be like, oh, right, I have a shoulder because Day has rested her hand on my shoulder. And so you're both shaking, you're offloading that energy, and you're connected to the other, you're connected to the earth, right? And so after that shaking finishes, which could be like 30 minutes or more, like could be 5 seconds, but it's not going to be, it's going to be like minutes to tens of minutes. And then what you want to do is really orient to the present in the exact way that we did the practice, right? So wherever you are, you finish shaking, you finish laughing, you finish crying. Again, laughing is fine. It's not indicative of your actual interpretation of the situation. Then you want to look around. You want to go, there's the trees, there's some alders, and I'm actually sitting on a mossy like rock, or I'm lying in some loam, and like really feel it too, right? Be like, oh, I'm lying there. It's actually a little wet. I feel a little wet. It's cool. Really get deep into your senses. If there's birds, say to yourself, I hear the birds. I hear the birds, right? Connect to every single sense you can, because that brings you still back in contact with being a person, being present, but in a safe way, right? It's also convincing your brain that the threat's over, as long as it is, right? Maybe you're back on the boat, or maybe, things aren't as scary, the threat's gone. And so by doing that, by letting you purge that energy that was built up, reinforcing through all your senses that the environment is actually not threatening, that gives the opportunity to not get locked up in that freeze. You get there, but you work it out, and the parasympathetic can come back on. So freeze doesn't always mean trauma, but it does if we don't respond to it properly. If we don't give the event its due process. Come back into present, come back into experience, and come back into contact with our body. If we get up into freeze and don't come back into a contact with our body, the longer we go in that state and the more everything feels threatening, pushing the line lower and lower and lower and lower. So this is the beautiful thing about traumatization in nature, as crazy as that sounds. There are so many opportunities to ground and to come back into contact with the body in ways that are easy or inspiring or fluid for us. If we're already people that find inspiration and love nature, right? If you get hit by a car in town or something, or you almost do, and you have a trauma reaction, like what are your options? You look around and it's like the annoying person climbing over you, walking their dog, and other cars. Like it's less appealing to go through that process of grounding back into things that feel good for you. So there's an opportunity here to have a very fluid relationship with traumatization and recovery. And I talk about this fluid relationship sort of like lackadaisically, because I truly believe that traumatization is an inevitable event, right? We want to assume these things are going to happen to us. Trauma is part of life. We just aren't taught what to do and how to work through it and how to shake and how to reconnect in the moment when it happens, right? And I'm not telling you this like as soon as you shake and reconnect with the trees that you're no longer going to feel fear or you're going to worry about the thing that happened. You absolutely are, because you'll be below the line, but you'll still be activated until you really come down. And also our psychological and cognitive, so our thoughts, a thought-based understanding of what happened stays the same. Like it was a thing, it wasn't great, but we're present, and that's what matters. We just need to come back to presence. So like the zebra, it shakes and starts eating again. It doesn't forget the cheetah existed, but it's back living its life very fast. Anna, go ahead.
I am curious about, so we're talking about trauma, of course, and one thing that comes up for me when I'm working with groups and talking about trauma is that some people, and I've noticed it as being like an intergenerational divide in this as well, like the older communities that I work with view trauma as like very intense life or death, like people coming back from war or who were abused, things like that, as trauma. And then the younger generations that I work with view trauma as a little bit more interpersonal. And I don't want to say like less than the war scenarios, but there is that kind of like different understanding of what is trauma and what is just like a stress reaction. I'm curious, like is there actually a difference in that level of trauma, or does our body all respond to it the same way?
Yeah. So I think this is the one piece you might have missed at the beginning, but it's really quick, so I can reiterate it. Trauma isn't an event. It's not war. It's not a car crash. It's a situation in which we are unable to cope or tolerate the level of stress we're experiencing in that moment. So someone could go to war and experience extreme violence and not be traumatized because for some reason their window of tolerance that day could tolerate that. And that same individual, right, on a different day has a lot of neurological load. They less tolerance that day. They fall down the stairs and they get traumatized. So it's less about the specifics, right? It's more about what is capable of being tolerated then and there.
I think one of the places where that kind of question comes from, because I hear it a lot too, Anna, is maybe coming from like the more psychiatric definition of trauma and what the DSM-5, defines trauma as. And, I mean, when we were in grad school together, Jeremy, like we had a trauma class, and there was these kind of different opinions on, what does and doesn't qualify as trauma. And I remember listening to one of our professors, say things like, well, this event or this category of events like divorces are not trauma, car crashes and life-threatening events, that's trauma, right? And so there is this kind of maybe difference of clinical opinion in what doesn't constitute trauma. But I haven't personally found that to be particularly a helpful way of looking at trauma, and it sounds like you haven't either.
Exactly. The DSM would say a real or perceived threat to life. But that would be weird because I have a lot of clients with 100% trauma symptoms who haven't had a threat to their life, right? It's because what is a threat to your life? It's an overwhelming level of stress that is unable to be coped with. And anything could do that. It doesn't mean everything's trauma, right? Like, I think sometimes people say everything's trauma, but not everything's trauma. Not even the worst events are trauma. It was the thing beyond the window of tolerance for that person in that moment. Yeah, hope that makes sense.
Wow, I'm just noticing the time, and
Yeah,
this is fascinating. And I also, want to respect people's time, most of all yours, Jeremy. Where do you want to go from this?
That was pretty much the end. It was sort of that last piece of like what happens when, and I guess I would say the same principle applies if you're with someone and it happens. Really encourage them to do that. Encourage them to shake. Give them very positive social responses. This is okay. Let this happen, right? Be the hand that touches their shoulder if they accept it, and then guide them to connect to their space afterwards. And then expect them to still be on edge after, but as long as they're present, then you've probably helped them stave off post-traumatic stress. Doesn't mean they're gonna be in a good mood, but you've probably prevented a long-term condition by suggesting by telling them their reactions, okay, let the body do what it needs to do, and giving space and time for that to happen.
One of the things we talk about in the course is just coming back to the idea of connection and relationship being so powerful and grounding in all the mental health work we do, but particularly with trauma, we go back to this idea of connection is the correction, connection is the correction.
Mm-hmm.
So I like that you're talking about that as a strategy kind of right from the beginning as well, like if there is a potentially traumatic exposure. Kathleen asked in the chat, where can I learn more about this subject?
Yeah. Well, there's a great book. I'll pull it out here. It's less about nature and specifically and stuff like that, but it's really the principles behind the somatic psychotherapy theories. Is this book, Waking the Tiger? Peter Levine's he's the guy. Yeah. It's a very easy to read book, and it's very, very interesting.
He also has that book in audio, which I've listened to. And he also has a few, I'm just going to see if I can find one real quick to recommend, because he has some really neat YouTube videos and even just like snippets of what you're talking about. And it's pretty cool to tie it all together. But yeah, Peter Levine's definitely well known.
Yeah.
I'd also say like, come take a course because we talk about this stuff. Maybe not quite as in depth as Jeremy does, but I'm hoping I can get Jeremy on as one of our facilitators one day. We'll see.
Yeah.
We'll see. But yeah, we do talk about trauma and support and resilience and all these different kinds of interventions we can raise all in the course. Kathleen, I saw you unmuted. Was that to ask a question?
No, I don't think so. I was just thinking. No, that was great. I can't remember how I came across the link to you guys. I think it was through one of my paddle affiliations somewhere along the line. So yeah, when you were talking about courses, I'll just have to go back to your website and have a look at all of that. Thanks.
Yeah, and I know you're involved in a couple different organizations too, and we do offer little mini workshops for organizations, especially nonprofits too. So if that's something of interest, feel free to be in touch as well.
Okay, thank you.
I just dropped in the chat a YouTube video. I think this is the one that I was thinking of. It is from Somatic Experiencing International. So that's part of the training that, or a good part of the training that Jeremy has is in the somatic experiencing kind of lens and way of doing things. And I think that is the video I was thinking of. It's got a lot of Peter Levine stuff and some really great footage of him. I think this is the one with the footage of him working. Yeah, it is. He was working with a vet with some pretty significant PTSD symptoms, and it's really interesting to see how he works.
Yeah, I should say that my talk here is influenced by somatic experiencing, but also my clinical work as well. And so it's not, I can't speak entirely from their perspective, but it's a lot of my training does come from there.
Yeah, thanks for that clarification.
Yeah. So that's
anything else you want to add,
I
Jen?
have. No,
Yeah.
I think yeah, but I'm happy to answer any questions.
Danita's
yeah, Danita.
I have to remember to unmute. I just want to know, Jeremy, what you are going to be doing with your knowledge afterwards, because I think you're very I can't think of a word, but I really like the way you present yourself. You're just like very calm and very you're very much into the people you're talking to. That's what it feels like. It feels really, really a nice connection.
Thank you so much.
I wonder what you're going to be doing with it later on.
Yeah, I mean, I do a lot of one-to-one on Zoom, and so, but yeah, like I do really just one-to-one clinical work all day, every day, and but yeah, I don't know. It's nice to hear that it like that it comes across well, because maybe I could do more of something like this as well. Again.
Yeah, just
thank you.
Feel kind of safe or something. You feel like calm and like you feel like you're a person who's like one of the good guys on the planet, you know?
Wow.
Somebody you
That's
feel
such an
like
honor.
if you had trauma, you could go to you easily. That's what I got. So
well, I really appreciate that comment, and it's a lot of the work I do is work with people who have experienced trauma. So getting that feedback is very helpful for me to know that, and it makes me feel like comfortable doing the work that I'm doing. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Jeremy. It's been super helpful.
You're welcome. Yeah, I'm happy to be here.
Thanks so much, Jeremy. Such a pleasure to have you here tonight, and really glad we got to get you on board. And thanks so much, everyone. It's 7 o'clock, so let's go off to our dinners and families and homes. And good night. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks.